This is the story of Greta, our perfect dog. She was found in the woods where she had lived for a while before she came to live with us. This is called Lost Dog Found. These are the stories that Greta tells me while we walk. I can't guarantee that they're all true, but this is what she says. This is Lost Dog Found. She didn't know who she was, but she was happy. She didn't know where she was, but she was not alone. She didn't know what she was, but it fit. It was joy. Wherever she was, it was warm and cozy, and she lay, surrounded by others who were just like her. They snuggled against their mother, the sun warm on their backs. The sound of snores like purrs filled the air as they napped. And when they woke, they jumped and twisted and turned and played and bounced. She was happy. She was joy. That was all she wanted to do, play, to jump, to bounce. She couldn't just sit or lie still. She had to move. There was so much room and so much bouncing to do. Until exhausted, she could nuzzle up once again to her mother and eat. She drank until she thought her belly might explode. She was so full, and then she slept and slept. She loved to sleep. She was happy. When she awoke, she and the brothers and sisters ran and bit and played and bounced together. They jumped on their mother, who was very tired, but took joy in all of her babies. That is the life of the very young. There are no worries except the empty belly, which is quickly remedied by a trip to mom. It is a time filled with play and joy, or should be. There was a sense of unease when the large two-legged animals came around. Her mother would shake and whimper as if they frightened her. Those two-legged things would pick up each of her brothers and sisters and look them over, then put them back down. They would look at her and shake their heads and walk away, never bothering to look her over. They made odd sounds, sounds that were not like the ones she made, not like the ones her people made. They were not barks and yips and squeals and whines. They were strange sounds. Those sounds did not frighten her. They were just different. She didn't know, and it didn't matter. She ate, she played, she bounced. She was happy. She was joy. But the strange sounds did frighten her mother. Time passed, and, as it did, she began to notice she was not exactly like her brothers and sisters. She was different. No one told her. They didn't have to. It was obvious as the sun and the dark. They still played with her. They always had. But she could tell they saw. She didn't look like them. They looked like the big puffy things way up above with patches of night. She looked like the dirt they lay on. Her brothers and sisters were beautiful. She was invisible, plain, and she was smaller than they were. When they played, she always wound up on the bottom of the pile. She would fight and bark and bite and push, but she couldn't get them off of her. She was too small. Still, she laughed, barked, and nipped just as they did, and when the pile spilled away, she would jump as high as they did. Sometimes she would even bounce higher. She was little, but she was filled with more joy than all of her brothers and sisters. Yes, she was small, and yes, she was plain. But in her heart, she was beautiful, and her paws were big, though in reality not as big as those of her brothers and sisters. Someday they would grow. She knew that her people treasured their paws above all else. When the two-leggeds did come around, they would always look at her paws, feel her ribs, stand her next to her siblings, and shake their heads. They did not seem happy. She was not like the rest of them. She was little, a different color, just not as pretty as her siblings. She did not fit in. These creatures made sure she knew and understood that. The family paid no attention to these creatures unless they were bringing food and filling their water bowls. They loved the little sister as they loved each other. They played and jumped and ran and twirled and bounced. It did not matter that she was small or plain, that she was of a different color and not beautiful. She was theirs, and that was all that mattered. Her mother lay on the ground so tired, shifting between being asleep and awake, fighting to keep her eyes open. She had so many children, she was just worn out. Yet she was so happy to see her children filled with joy. She had many, many children, but they did not stay with her long, and now she was weary. She just wanted to sleep for a very long time. One day the pups awoke to find their mother gone. They looked everywhere, but there were not a lot of places to look. The place where they slept and ate was roomy, but there was no place to hide, just a small amount of grass patched into an area of dirt in which to run and play. There was a box they could go to if it was wet from the sky, but not much more. They began to fret and cry until her biggest brother nipped and bit at the others, and the game was on. They played until they fell into a deep sleep. They woke to find food and water and play, and so life continued for a long time. Thoughts of their mother faded with each passing day. The sun was warm on her back as she played and jumped, bouncing with her family. The air was cool and getting colder. She liked how it felt. It had been too warm for her. What with her double coat more suited to colder climes, the cold made her feel frisky and full of energy. She wanted nothing more than to run and play. She jumped on her big brothers and scattered her sisters, racing towards them only to stop inches before plowing into them. And they jumped in all directions to avoid her. She was still not big, but she had grown and could pack a wallop when she careened into others. It made her laugh, her tongue lolling from her mouth, bouncing and then tearing off towards where the woods stood, dark and foreboding. The forest frightened her. She could hear other creatures prowling late at night and could smell the danger. But there was a fence and it would keep her safe. That she knew. She didn't worry she would go too far, as that same sturdy fence would stop her before she could get into trouble. So she and her brothers and sisters raced around and around, knocking into each other and rolling on the ground only to get up and chase each other faster. And as she ran by the back fence, her largest brother was waiting, and he bolted towards her. He ran full steam into her side, and they tumbled and bowled right into the fence. It came down with a crash. They lay on the ground, panting and staring at the freedom of the wide open forest. The others raced out the opening and scattered into the woods. They scampered every which way until she could only hear them crashing through the underbrush and yipping with the joy of newfound freedom. She wanted to chase after them. They were having so much fun. But she was afraid. She didn't know what the woods were. She had never ventured there. But she knew she didn't want to be in them. It was scary in there. They heard howls and yips, screeches and growls late at night. They had cuddled by their mother for protection. But now there was no mother, no protection. But she couldn't stay here by herself. All her brothers and sisters were in the forest. She would have to go find them. She followed their scent, though, for as much noise as they made banging through the bushes and undergrowth, she could have found them if she was blind and had no nose. So she followed the sounds, slowly, cautiously, fearfully creeping into the woods. And they continued to move deeper and deeper into the dark and sinister woods. She heard the monster's roar before she saw its horrible burning eyes. She had seen the thing around her home, but it had remained far enough away it didn't frighten her much. But now in the depths of the dark forest, it roared and rolled over the bushes and grass, knocking down small trees as if they were nothing, and then it came to a halt. Several of the two-leggeds jumped from the back of the monster, and more got out of the openings on its side. They had ropes and nets and cages. They scattered into the forest trying to find her family. She just knew it in her heart, right down to her bone. They were hunting for her and her brothers and sisters. She froze. They hadn't seen her, though they were almost right in front of her. She blended into the background. Her color was the same as the dried leaves and dirt where she stood. If she didn't move, they might not see her, though they would hear the pounding of her heart. She took slow, deep breaths to calm herself, and slowly eased herself down onto the ground. Soon the two-leggeds came back carrying all of her brothers and sisters. They had not blended into the forest with their white and black coats. They had stood out like the clouds in the sky, and they had not been quiet. They had been caught up in their play and hadn't noticed the monster raging through the forest. They had her whole family captured and caged. One two-legged came back empty-handed. He made unhappy noises and pointed for all the others to get inside and onto the belching monster. As he got into his side, he looked all around the woods, trying to see, trying to hear. Though how he would hear anything but the horrible monster, she had no idea. And then he signaled for them to leave. The monster roared as he got in, and then spit a bark of fire out the back end. She jumped with fright and started running as fast as all four of her legs could carry her. Swift as the wind, she wound through the trees, away from the rumbling roar of the monster on wheels. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. So she ran and ran and ran until she couldn't hear the roaring or anything but forest quiet. She stopped, exhausted by a quiet creek. The water flowed calmly through the woods. She could go no further. She would have to make a place to sleep here. But first she had to quench her thirst. All that running and dodging and hiding had made her very thirsty. She drank her fill, both satisfying her thirst and filling her empty belly. It would have to be enough for now. Pushing and scraping with her paws, she dug into the soft bank of the stream. She pushed leaves into the hollow she dug out so she would have a bed, though there would be no one to warm her. When she was done, she had carved herself a nice hideaway where she could nuzzle and snuggle and not be seen by anyone. She was alone, but she was safe. Leaves fell overnight and covered her hidey hole and her in comfort. She did not hear the nighttime forest sounds and slept without fear. She opened her eyes to see several small creatures that in some ways resembled her. They had 4 legs and sat accordingly. They walked properly on all 4 feet, but they had little puffs for tails and their ears stood straight up. They stared at her as she came awake. She couldn't place them, but they looked familiar. She didn't fear them. She was certain they offered no threat. She raised her head to see them better, and they rose onto their haunches as if to run. The air was tense. They were frightened. She could chase them, maybe eat them. She was so hungry. But she didn't want to be alone. She had discovered she didn't like alone. She lay her head back down, and they sat once again. She wondered again if she could eat them. She was certainly hungry enough. Then one of them bounced. It bounced high and landed soft, looking her right in the eye as if challenging her to do the same. No, she wouldn't eat them. She would bounce with them. It felt like forever since she had bounced and played and jumped and ran just for fun. It had been forever since she had been filled with her joy. She would do so now and eat later. Breakfast could wait. She followed them around the woods, playing hide and seek, jumping higher and higher until it seemed they would reach the sky. They ran until hunger would not be held off. The small creatures with the pointed ears and puffy tails stopped to eat tall grass. She had never eaten grass before, but she was very hungry. Some were brown and dry, some were still green and moist, but it didn't taste horrible, and it filled her belly. She could eat this. She scavenged for what might be left by other hunters in the forest. She would eat bark off the trees if she had to. She was so hungry. As she walked along, sniffing the air, the ground, the trees and bushes, she scented something just under the ground. She dug until she came across the roots of plants scattered along the forest floor. Many had a pleasant flavor and filled her belly. She could be content in these woods. She slept the rest of the afternoon away with the small creatures tucked in around her, just as her mother had done with her siblings. She missed them terribly. And when she awoke, she was alone. All the small four-legged had gone away. She discovered a new emotion, loneliness, and she didn't like it. She had to find others to be with. She was not one for living alone outdoors. She had been born and raised with her mother and family in an enclosed area. She did not run free. They did not wander through the forest. They did not know how. She was lost. She had no idea how she had come to be wherever she was. They had all been running and bouncing and playing, and she hadn't paid attention to how she had come to be lost. The best thing to do, she thought, was to start walking in one direction. Hopefully, the direction they had come from. She walked and walked. All the trees and bushes looked alike. She couldn't tell one from another. She could be walking in circles and would never know. She had come to look like the trees and bushes. Her fur was full of twigs, leaves, burrs, dirt, and small branches. She looked like nothing more than a small bush walking around lost in the forest. She rubbed against the trees and rolled on the ground, but couldn't loosen all the debris she had picked up on her legs, stomach, and along her back. It was uncomfortable and itched and scratched. She was miserable, not her natural state of mind. Hunger gnawed at her belly. She would have to find more of the tall grasses she'd eaten and dig up some more of the goodness buried under the ground and attached to the plants above. She would find food. She had to. The forest opened up and she could see far to her right and far to her left. There was a wide, black, hard surface that wound its way through the gap. She would have to cross it if she was going to go in the same direction. Though she did not remember crossing it before, but she'd been very busy playing. She took a step and felt the rumble before hearing something coming from her left. It sounded like the monster the two-leggeds had ridden around her home and brought to the woods to capture her family. Fear gripped her heart. She froze, and then she saw it. It rumbled and roared as it charged down the black path. She couldn't move. Terror gripped her heart, her legs, her feet froze to the ground. It screamed challenge and screamed again, its eyes shining into hers. Now, almost on top of her, it screamed again, loud, piercing, terrifying, and she jumped back just as it flew past. The wind from its passing knocked her over, and she tumbled away from the horrible thing. She lay in the tall grass, whimpering and crying. So frightened was she. She would never be able to survive out here alone. She had to find some help. Which way to go? She thought about crossing that black, desolate area, but as quick as she did, another of the terrible monsters Belching smoke and screams rumbled loudly by. That would not do. She turned back towards the forest. It was dark and scary, but not as scary as those monsters. She walked slowly into the woods. She was thirsty. She'd been walking all day, and now night was coming. She needed water. She had no idea where the little stream she'd slept near was located. She had to hope luck would lead her to water. One foot in front of the other and hope riding her shoulder, she strode into the woods. She heard them, off to her right. She heard them. They were barking? Not exactly, but it sounded almost like barking. A honking kind of bark, a calling to her to come. She ran through the underbrush directly to the sounds. If they weren't her family, they were some kind of family, and she'd had enough of lonely to last her the rest of her life. She broke through the tall grass, almost running into the pond spread out before her. A forest pond with a small stream running into it and out of it. Tall grass and trees imprisoned and hid the tranquil pool and the strangest creatures she had ever seen. They walked or waddled on two short legs, their small heads stretched towards the sky on long necks, and they honked. They honked at each other, the pond and her. They honked and honked, flapping their wings and running towards her. She waited, patient, for them to come play with her. But they didn't want to play. They wanted to bite and nip at her. They chased her from one to the other and back to the first again. They were mean. She had no idea what to do, so she ran for the water. It would protect her from them, she hoped, and she was thirsty. But they ran right into it, behind her, nipping and biting at her legs, pecking at her back end. The nasty honking and the sound of wings flapping followed her into the pool. Now what should she do? Probably get a drink of water while most of her was submerged and protected, and then get out of the pond and back to the security of the woods. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. She wasn't sure what she expected when she ran for the pond, but sinking wasn't it. And she sank like a rock. She had never swum before, or been in water deeper than a drinking dish, and had no idea what would happen. Well, she knew now. Paddling all four paws and trying to keep her head above the water, she began to make progress. Okay. She began to move in the direction she wished, gulping water and splashing, kicking and fighting all the way. Finally, she found a rhythm and discovered if she just let her legs do the work and not try to think about what she was doing, just do it, she was fine. Her head up, her butt down, away from the pecking of the horrors, she made for the far shore. She drank her fill while wading across the expanse of water. The things followed her, chasing her the whole way. She barked a warning, but they paid no attention, just swimming and biting until she had almost reached the other side. She had to get out of this pond and hightail it to the security of the forest. She hoped. As she exited the pond, a sparkle or flash caught her eye. There, glimmering in the fading sunshine, was a fresh, dead fish. Apparently someone else had come to this pond, grabbed dinner, and then was chased off by these horrid creatures before they could eat. Well, she was not going to let their sacrifice go to waste. She ran out of the pond and grabbed the discarded carcass of the fish and darted for the forest. Her plan had worked. She grabbed dinner, quenched her thirst in one fell swoop. She had to find someplace safe to eat her stolen meal, far away from these frightful animals. Someplace safe, away from all the terrors of the forest. Someplace she could rest. She knew she couldn't go back towards the pond. She couldn't go back towards the black path, with the scary, ghastly monsters screaming along it. She would have to venture further into the forest and hope. It was full-on dark when she stumbled into the depression covered by tree root. She lost whatever was left of her fish as she tumbled down between the roots and fallen branches. Well, it wasn't what she had hoped would happen. No one likes to fall home. But it was hidden from the predators and scary things of the night. Maybe she would find the rest of her fish, eat, and settle in for a night's rest. She awoke with a start and fear gripping her heart. The flash of light had made the day come, if only for a moment, right in the middle of the night. It was brilliant enough it woke her out of a very sound and restful sleep. It was just as well that it had, or the great clap bang of sound would have a moment later. It was so loud it hurt her ears and terrified her more than anything yet. And that was saying something, as there had been so many terrible and frightening things in these woods. She was sure her heart would stop long before any animal could harm her. And then another. Did this nightmare never end? The brilliant flash in the sky followed almost immediately by the profound crash and explosion of thunder. Her ears rang from the deafening crack, and she trembled in fear. So loud it shook the forest and the trees she hid under. She quaked and quivered and shook. Could this get any worse? And the rain came pounding down through the dense forest canopy, filling her hidey hole. It didn't get deep enough she would drown, but it was deep enough she was miserable. She huddled and shook the whole night through, until finally, just before dawn, the storm moved on. She fell into an exhausted sleep. She climbed out of her hidey hole as the sun woke the forest. Birds chirped in the trees and squirrels ran hither and yon, collecting and then burying acorns and other nuts. A cool wind blew through the trees and they swayed in the sky. No one but her seemed to remember the horror of the night before. She was hungry, though not starving, and thirsty. She thought about sneaking back to the pond for a quick drink, but the sound of honking throughout the air convinced her otherwise. She would have to rely on luck to find another source of water. For now, she just wanted to lie in the partial shade of the tree and enjoy the morning. She had never needed to eat immediately upon awakening. She did because if she didn't, her brothers and sisters would leave her nothing to eat. But she was content to ease into the day when allowed. She would get up soon and seek food and water. For now, she would nap a little while longer, a much-needed nap after the terror of the night. She yawned and stretched and smiled. Her fear was fading into memory. She had seen the worst the forest could present, and she had survived. Well, so far. It felt like she had been here forever, though she knew it had only been a couple of days. She had found she would not starve, and she could find water. Though she might have to stumble across it, it was here. She would live. With a renewed sense of confidence, she stood, stretched, and picked a direction to go in search of food and drink. As she walked through the woods, she found tall grasses still with the dew of morning on them. They would provide everything she needed to begin the day. Everything but companionship. She was lonely. Her whole life she had been surrounded, comforted, wrapped in her family. They ate together, slept together, played, bounced, jumped, and ran together. She missed them terribly and wanted nothing more than to lay in the pile with them and feel the warmth and love of their bodies. And then, for a day, she had wrapped herself in the comfort of the small people. They had run and played and jumped, but for far too short a time. She needed to walk. She loved to walk. It gave her a sense of purpose and joy. She needed joy. She hadn't walked far when she saw them. They were beautiful, tall and brown like she was, though the small ones had splotches of pure cloud on them. The large ones had great branches coming out of their heads. They were majestic, and she thought them forest deities. They saw her and stood perfectly still, watching her, waiting to see what she might do. So she did the same. She stood without even wagging her tail and waited. At last, the largest of the group leaned down to grab a tuft of grass, ripping out of the ground and chewing. Still watching her warily, the others followed suit. She lay down to wait. She was hungry again, but thought it would be wrong to eat while they ate. She should wait. He nodded and pointed with his muzzle at the grasses around them. Was he giving her permission? She slowly eased herself up and walked over to where they ate. It was dry and brown. The morning dew had evaporated, but it didn't taste bad, and it filled the stomach. Two of the young ones came over to her and nuzzled her, pushing and prodding her, as if wanting to play. They danced with each other, pretending to butt heads and scamper about the clearing. They ran through the underbrush and over fallen trees. They ran at each other and then veered off and away from each other, chasing, jumping, playing. They frolicked without concern and without noticing where they ran. But she did. Soon they were headed over in the direction where she knew the monsters had been roaring the day before. There was no sound of them this deep in the forest, but she knew. She remembered and had to stop them. She ran as hard and fast as she could to stop them, to herd them away from the danger. She didn't know why. It was something deep inside that called to her, something bred into her from the beginning of time. She was a bearded collie. She knew it in her bones, and this is what her people did. The great stag ran after her, afraid she was now hunting its young. They all ran, some in fear, some in play, some in anger, but all in the same direction. She heard it in the distance. She heard the roar of the beast as it made its way along the black path. It was coming. It was hunting, and would have the small deer if she didn't stop them. She heard it scream as it saw the children play. She ran hard until she was sure her heart would give out or her lungs would explode. The stag, fast on her heels, still not certain whether she was trying to help or harm. He was not going to let her harm his children. And then it seemed to hear the huge monster a moment before it came around the bend. He was too far away to save his children. He ran faster, though would never make it in time. The little dog exploded out of the woods, gave one last burst and jumped, barking and twisting in the air, scaring the fawns away from the black path and back into the woods. The monster flew by, missing all by inches. She lay where she had fallen, her head swimming in relief and exhaustion. After several long moments, she stood and trotted towards the forest where the small deer had entered. She saw them and ran to join them, and to be certain they would not return to the black path. The stag caught up to all of them and settled them enough so they quit running. He nuzzled the little dog as she panted, her breath gushing in and out of her body, shaking from fear, exhaustion, relief, and giddy from what she had done. After a long, long time, they all had their breath back, and they walked together, deeper into the safety of the forest. They pushed further into the woods and away from the loud monsters screaming by on the black, dead ground. Fluff and flakes began to fall on them from above. The Great One began to push the young and females deeper into the woods, nodding for the little one to follow. Clouds scudded across the sky. The wind blew out of the north, pushing cold air and snow ahead of it. The woods provided some protection from the coming winter, but not nearly enough for the small deer. They shivered as they walked, seeking shelter out of the cold. She danced along next to them, wanting them to play, to jump, to bounce. Wasn't this wonderful? She licked the white falling from the sky and jumped into the air, turning midair before landing, facing them with a joyous smile. They stared at her and shivered. Wasn't she cold? No! What is cold? Is that why their fur shook and shivered along their banks? Yes! How can you not feel the cold? I just feel happy. This white is wonderful. She rolled and dug her nose in the growing deep white blanket and jumped high in the air, landing on her belly. She jumped back up to her feet and ran around in circles, bouncing and begging them to play. But they were too cold. They would seek shelter, out of the wind, out of the cold, out of the snow. She followed along, as she didn't want to feel the lonely again. Within a stand of high grass, they lay down to wait out the storm. She would lay out in the falling snow to guard. She now knew this was her job, what she had been bred for, to protect the herd. It was as much of who she was as was joy. She would defend her beautiful new family. She would give her life if she had to, because they were magnificent. She was not magnificent. She was not beautiful. She was not important. She would guard those who were. And so she had adopted and been adopted by a new family. They weren't like her. They were tall and beautiful, graceful and majestic. And she was short and the color of dirt, clumsy, and didn't know anything about how to survive. She would stay with them. They would teach her. As the days passed and food became more scarce, they showed her how to find patches of grass beneath the snow and berries still clinging to bushes. She found the remains of animals who had perished in the storm. It was gross, but it would keep her alive. She was content. She would protect her herd and take her joy from that. The night was cold and food had become more scarce than normal. She slept just outside the grove where her family slept to protect them from any predator with hunger in their eyes. She heard something. The snap of a twig, the brush of hunter on bush. She was immediately awake. Frightened, but awake. Was something coming for her family? Was some animal coming to do harm while they slept? She waited. She sniffed the air. Yes, there was some other coming their way. More than one. Now she was very frightened. They would never know that unless they could smell it on the air. She shivered, and not from the cold. She might be small, she might be young, but her job was to protect the herd. They were her family, and she would protect those who had taken her in, even if it meant her life. She was more frightened even than when the loud sound had shaken the woods, and the brilliant light had split the air. But love would give her strength. As the invaders crept in closer, she jumped up high from where she lay in the snow, barking and snarling like 10. She jumped and ran side to side. She would make it seem like she was a pack they didn't want to mess with. She broke branches and rustled the barren bushes. She was a one-puppy army. And then she ceased her commotion. Had it worked? She lay for several seconds, nose buried in the snow, still as a tree and quiet as the night. She listened, relieved as they moved on by. She had done her job. They would not bother her family. As she lay back down, knowing how brave she had been, never noticing the large stag, antlers down, standing behind her. He turned and silently crept back to his does and fawns. The night would pass without further incident. And so life continued, searching for food, protecting the family, playing with her new brothers and sisters. When they weren't too cold, she smiled. Trying to get the twigs, leaves, and branches out of her coat, and waiting on the spring. It wasn't an easy life, not as easy as she had known when she had lived with her first family. No one brought food and water. No one came in to inspect her to make certain she was healthy. There was no fence to keep predators and evil away from her. But she was free to run in the forest, free to go where she would, free without others to look at her ugly, plain self and shake their heads. Here no one seemed to notice she was different. They all worked together, kept each other safe and fed. It was a good life, though there was something missing. She couldn't put her paw on what, but something in her chest that felt empty. An itch behind her ear or on her tummy that couldn't be scratched. Sticks and leaves stuck to her thick, heavy coat. They were uncomfortable, but she couldn't pull them out, nor could anyone in her family. Their coats were short and didn't suffer such indignities. Something was missing that was more than a scratch or a grooming. Something deep within her, in her heart. It was not filled with the joy she loved so much. Oh, she was happy. She couldn't help but be happy. It was who she was. But there was a sadness on the edges, though she could not say why. She thought about this a great deal, as she had not much else to do. Most of the young of her new family didn't want to play and jump and bounce as much as she did. They just wanted to lie together to keep warm. She wanted to play in the cold snow and do twists and turns in the airs. It was cold, fresh, invigorating, and made joy come beaming out of her eyes. She played in the snow, bouncing, jumping, pretending to have someone to play with. She began to feel the pangs of loneliness once again. Sadness found its way into her heart as she walked through the forest deep in thought. She wished she had someone, anyone, even two-leggeds to play with. She played hide and seek with an imaginary family, running from tree to tree, jumping and landing in the deep snow. So lost in her play, she hardly noticed that she was lonely. As she played her fantasy games, she scented something wonderful. Her belly growled. Her nose smiled. She followed it to an open place in the forest, where there lay a pile of food. There was no other way to describe it. It was a pile of food, out in the middle of the forest. Oh my, she thought. Not grass, not old frozen berries, not what was left of someone else's dinner, but real food. She could hardly contain her excitement or hunger. But she had to be careful. What if it was a trap? Her friends, the small four-leggeds with the large ears, had warned her in their way about traps. Her family also told her to watch for the two-leggeds, as they were dangerous and wanted only to harm the people. So caution should be the rule. But she saw nothing. Well, nothing but the deliciousness in front of her. She could scent nothing, could feel nothing, nothing except her hunger, and that easily won out over caution. The wire box dropped the instant she took her first bite, slamming hard on the ground and trapping her. Oh, what had she done? How had she been so foolish? She shivered, not from the cold of the outside, but from the cold of her insides. She ate, slow and deliberate, though this is what had gotten her into this mess in the first place. But she was hungry, and it tasted good. It was not the grass, berries, or what she had scavenged in the woods. It was real food, and if this was going to be her last meal, she would eat her fill. The night lasted forever. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking at every sound coming from the forest deep. Someone would come, she knew. They didn't set traps to let the quarry die. She would have to try and be patient and see what transpired. She woke from her fitful sleep. Dreams and nightmares had filled the night. Monsters came at her and taunted her. She couldn't run away, as she was trapped in a cage, even in her dreams. They glared at her with hungry eyes and sharp teeth. She was brave, but even the bravest can be afraid. And she was. She kicked and ran and flopped around inside the cage, not waking until now. And she saw them. There were several of them quietly creeping out of the woods through the morning light. They didn't seem threatening at all. Well, not for two-leggeds. They spoke gently and with reassurance, as if not to frighten her. She watched them with a wary eye. One had a rope. They meant to capture her. Well, she would show them. She was young, she was quick, she knew the forest. She was more clever than they could imagine. Hadn't she chased away the monsters coming for her family? She felt her fear melt away, replaced by her great courage. She watched intently as the smallest of the group came over to the box. It bent down and flipped a latch. Carefully, it opened the door. She crouched, making ready to bolt. But before she could jump, another, larger, reached in from behind. She hadn't noticed there was another door, and grabbed her by the scruff of the neck. She was trapped. She squirmed and twisted and tried to pull away, but she couldn't break loose of the grip. She tried to bite the hand that held her, but it was just out of her reach. Finally, she quit. She was caught. She could not escape. Let them kill her. She had known a good life. But they did not harm her. They didn't pounce or tighten their grip. They just held tight enough so she couldn't get away. And they continued to reassure her. One held out a cookie. She didn't want to take it, but it was a cookie. The two-legged talked softly and stroked her head, scratched her behind the ears, and another began to rub her belly. She didn't know what they wanted with her, but they could have it. This was when her life began to change. These two-leggeds were kind and gentle. They spent hours and hours and hours pulling sticks, twigs, burrs, and leaves out of her fur. They combed where they could and cut where they couldn't. They cut a lot. But they were so tender and soothing. They talked to her and rubbed her belly and scratched her rear, under her chin and behind her ears. Most of all, they carefully pulled the large biters off her. These things had been driving her to distraction, biting and making her itch. The relief she felt was blissful. she once again felt joy. She was in a large box sometimes, but mostly she was outside in a place that reminded her of her first home. Except there was grass instead of dirt, water bowls everywhere, and cookies. Lots of cookies. And none of the other people were chained or looked tired and sickly. There were people for her to run with and jump with, and most of all, bounce with. She was happy. She was joy. She was full. Oh my, how they fed her. Twice a day, morning and night, and not grass and scavenged food, but real food. She thought she had found the most wonderful place she had ever seen or felt or lived. It was perfect. Until one day when the kindly female two-legged who had cared for her and loved her put her in a box and slid her into a silent monster. They rode here and there forever. She was scared and confused. Why would they take her away from a place where she had found such joy? Where were they taking her? When they finally stopped, the woman put a rope around her neck. She was frightened. Was she going to be left in the woods again? She didn't want to go back there. She missed her forest family, but she loved where she was. They walked through a huge door into a large open room. There were other two-leggeds in there. She saw one, and their eyes met. The two-legged let out a cry of joy, her hands coming to her face in happiness, and fell to the ground. She held out her arms to the beautiful puppy, straining at her rope. The little, though not so little really, puppy felt terrible. So she ran and jumped into this woman's lap. She was far too big for the lap, but no one seemed to care. She just somehow fit. Rain came from the eyes of the two-legged. She hugged and kissed and stroked and hugged and kissed and stroked, and told her she was beautiful. Beautiful. Can you imagine? This person thought the plain, dirt-colored, invisible creature was beautiful. And so she was. She licked the woman's face and tried to bury herself deep into that lap. She was happy. She was joy. And just when she thought she could feel no more bliss, another came and kneeled next to both of them, and he rubbed her belly and behind her ears and hugged her almost as tight. His eyes were raining just as hard as he told her he loved her too. She realized she might have been wrong. Maybe where she had been wasn't perfect. Maybe where she was going would be better. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so plain and brown and invisible. Maybe she was the only one who thought so. Maybe she really was beautiful. No one else had ever told her she wasn't. And these two-leggeds told her over and over she was beautiful. And maybe they were right. And she was happiness. She was joy. She was Greta. I don't know if these stories are true, but they are what we talk about when Greta and I walk. She tells me these things so I will know how happy she is to live with us. Sometimes as we walk close to the woods, she stops and stares. And I wonder if she misses it. But she shakes, and soon we are walking again. Though I think she misses the deer. We will be walking and come across several deer munching by a creek. She will stop. She does not bark. She does not approach. She stands and watches them. Inevitably, one will lift their head, and they share a look. The deer seem to know she represents no danger, and they go back to eating, and we walk on. She will look up at me with a huge smile on her face, and then bump into my legs as if to reassure. She then will jump and spin and bounce and push her way through my legs. It is her way of telling me she loves me. She is happiness. She is joy. Bearded collies, or beardies as they are known, were bred to herd sheep in Scotland. They are happy, clownish, joyful, wonderful dogs. Gentle, smart, loving, and extraordinarily beautiful. She makes us laugh every day and fills our hearts with love. They are love. They are joy on four legs. We ask that you please consider adoption. There are thousands of dogs who are seeking their forever homes. They just need love. Greta is from Canine Lifeline, and her sister Harper came to us recently from Friendship APL. There are organizations all over the country who will be happy to pair you up with the love of your life.